Yeah. Yeah, the same thing. He did come to that temple and destroy it. So let's just say Revelation 6, the sixth seal is, you could say, the coming of the Lord. So with Hebrew parallelism, you could theoretically say something a different way, but still mean the same thing. So now when you talk about these trumpets, it's saying the same thing, but just saying it differently, you can say. Like maybe they have different effects, but in reality, it's all talking about the same event. I mean, so could it possibly, if the Bible, if Revelation, the recapitulation, or however you say it, if that is true, wouldn't it also follow that the bowls, the trumpets, the scroll, aren't they all just the same thing? Because you have
Yep.
here, if Revelation, if the seven scroll, if the sixth seal is the coming of the Lord, and the seventh seal is when the angels were given the trumpets, right? And according to Revelation chapter 8, verse 1, and it says, when he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour, and I saw seven angels who stood before the Lord, and seven trumpets were given to them. So again, you have now the seven seals of seven trumpets, but now it's pretty much going back in to this recapitulation thing or whatever. And then when you look in Revelation 11, verse 15, now you have the seventh trumpet being blown. And I know we're going to read Revelation 11, but I'm just going to read this just for now. But it says, so Revelation 11:15 says, then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there was a loud voice, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. And the 24 elders who sit on the throne on their thrones before God fell on their faces, and they worshipped God, saying, we give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who is and who was, for you have taken your great power begun to reign. The nations rage, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and the reward of the reward into wait, sorry, and the rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. And God's temple in heaven was open, and the ark of the covenant was seen within his temple. There was flashing and lightnings and rumblings, peals of thunder and earthquakes and heavy hail. So pretty much again, now we have the seventh trumpet again. It's the coming of the Lord. It's the judgment. It's the time for the judgment of the dead. And do you see that verse 18? It's the time for the dead to be judged, the reward the servants, the prophets. This is, you know, Revelation chapter 20. So I mean that's so again. So if the seven seals and the trumpets are all talking about and all consummating at the same end event, which is the coming of the Lord. Again, then you go to chapter 14. Here it is again, the harvest of the earth. Revelation 14:14. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then the earth, then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And the other angel came out of the altar, and the angel who had the authority over fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grapes, the grape harvest, the grape harvest of the earth, and threw them into a great winepress of the wrath of God. and the winepress was trotted outside the city. The blood followed from the winepress was bridle for 1600 status. So again, I mean, sounds like to me, again, the same thing in chapter 6, chapter 11, chapter 14, then you have chapter 19, then you have chapter 20. I mean, it sounds like just all the same thing over and over and over again. Like we were talking about
Mm-hmm.
before, like Hebrew parallelism, like at its finest.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, I mean, like I know a lot of the Hebrew parallelism in the Old Testament was them repeating themselves multiple times. But I mean, do you know places where like it would kind of fit where they would say something one way and then like a couple verses later say the same thing but say it differently?
The only thing I can think of is the parables. He was telling them the parables. As far as I'm concerned, the parables are all pretty much the same thing told like 15 different ways.
That is actually kind of true. You know, like all those parables of the kingdom, they're all just different spiritual, physical stories that represented the spiritual truth in, the kingdom of God.
Then you've got also Peter, using fire language like Malachi was, and bringing in that imagery. So, like several years apart, but you've got two different authors doing it, not just one author doing it, and saying, the destruction's going to happen this way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I'm going to see what happens if you Google Hebrew parallelism.
But yeah, the idea of all of the kingdom of heaven is like this. The kingdom of heaven like this. One parable right after the another is just like that parallelism. It's not just one the verse right next to it like we see, which we commonly see as Hebrew parallelism, like which in Proverbs. But it's like the stories, the events, and then you have another one. So Christ would do it, and John would do it in Revelation.
Hmm.
What
I
does it
see.
say?
I see some interesting stuff here. Parallelism in Hebrew poetry. So it's giving me a quote here from Psalms. I think this is 24, 1 verses 2. The earth is the Lord's, the world, for it was he who formed it and planted it, and all that is in it, and those who dwell therein, upon the sea and upon the waters beneath. So they say, here we have a synonyms. For some reason, it's a little blurry on this. So I guess this page is kind of old, maybe. Here we have a synonymous. I can't really.
Synonymous.
Yeah, synonymous distych dist. I don't even know.
DYS what?
Distych. Never even seen that word in my life. Yeah, let's look at this one. It's another page. Yeah, right here. Revelation is Hebrew parallelism to the full. All right, perfect. But yeah, I mean, if you Google Hebrew parallelism, I mean, there's lots of stuff on it. And just in like the main search, it says, "What is parallelism? It is the structure of thought rather than external, from like meter or rhyme, in which the writer balances a series of words so that patterns of deliberate contrast or interna- uh, international repetition appears. Here are some examples of the Hebrew Bible to illustrate such parallelisms.
In other words, I would say that it's a great compliment because you're
Here, I'm
saying the
gonna do this. I'm gonna share my thing. How do I do that again? Yeah, this right here. I will share. All right, you guys can see this. This is it
yep.
right here. This is the word. I mean, I can't highlight it for some reason. I can only like move it. But this is the word I was trying to say. I don't know if you could see it though. Distych.
Dystich? No, I've never seen that either.
Never in my life. But yeah. So it gives a couple of examples of like, so it's not just uh, like the Psalms and Proverbs. It even says First Samuel 15:22.
I would say that Hebrew parallelism is a great compliment because what they're actually saying is that the idea that I have to convey to you is above language, and so I'm going to have to show you several different pictures of it so that you can get the meta narrative.
Well, I looked up that word distich, and the only thing that came up was in Super Glossary. It says entertainment literature, distich, the technical term for a two-line group in which a pair of metrical lines of different lengths together compose or express a complete idea.
Well, I guess that's what that is right there. The two lines, differences, I guess. But yeah. All right. See that we learned something new.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'm seeing here, definition of distich, is a pair of verse lines, a couplet.
Kind of in a way, the history of mankind keeps repeating itself too. The ultimate living, breathing distich.
Yeah, I remember. You guys ever heard of a guy named Rico Cortez?
Is that the guy with the hat?
Yeah, they got the hat. So I used to listen to him a lot back in the day. Well, maybe like 3 years ago. But he said that there was a thought, not like actual truth, but he said that there was a thought in like you know Judaism or whatever that because there's something called like the Sabbath like year every 7 years will be a Sabbath, a land rest, right? So he said that maybe, and they're in the interpretation of we're almost entering into the 6,000 year, the last millennium until the seventh day, and the seventh day will be over, and the eighth day. And he was saying that he's thinking maybe creation starts over and it goes back, and we're in the seventh one, or he was saying, but kind of like that, you know, when the world ends, it just literally repeats itself. Bam, back at Adam and Eve again.
I think there's another guy on YouTube that talks about a lot of the Native American tribes and stuff that says that we are in the fifth age, and at the end of each age is like a massive destruction and then starting over all again. And that before in Christ's time it was the age of the fish, and then we have all that fish imagery, and that coincides with the Mazzaroth and the sign, the stars up in the sky. So now we are in the sign of Aquarius, and during Moses' time, it was the sign of the bull.
Well, I think we're actually in the sign of Tupac. But I guess y'all want to jump into 11. That's what we're in, right? Or did you guys do something on Monday?
No, we're in 11, I believe.
I know this is a very interesting chapter.
William Bell did something on 11. I talked to him on a little bit.
I was listening to the that one young Daniel Rogers guy. You know him?
He's put out some videos, but I haven't watched him. No, I don't really care for his accent too much. It's hard for me to follow.
Yeah. It's funny. He lives in Florida. He lives like maybe like 4 hours from me. He has a church too, but he's doing a filling in for Don Preston this week, and he's doing the Man of Sin, and he was gave an interesting interpretation, I guess. Like the Man of Sin was like the zealots. Usually people say like it was like Nero or it was something like Roman Empire or something like that. But
Hmm.
always different interpretations. But I know Revelation 11 is a very interesting chapter to talk about like the timing of Revelation. Because the temple is still there.
That's true.
And then it talks about, which is one of the best verses to prove who is, the whore, Babylon. So I guess who wants to jump right in?
I read last time.
I mean, I guess I can read it. So, I will start. It says, "Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, 'Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Those These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord on the earth. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, that is how he is doomed to be killed. They have power to shut the sky, that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying, and they have the power over the waters to turn them into blood, and strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war with them, and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the streets of the great city that is symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some from the peoples and the tribes and the language and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb, and those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents, because these 2 prophets had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and the great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a voice from the heavens saying to them, 'Come up here.' And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. And at that hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to God of heaven. And the second woe has passed. Behold, the third woe is soon to come. Then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven, saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. And the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshipped God, saying, we give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who is and who was. For you have taken the great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time of the dead to be judged, and the rewarding your servants, and the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great, for the destroying destroyers of the earth. Then heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There was flashing and lightnings, rumbling, peals of thunder, and earthquake, and heavy hail. So, a couple things I want to just talk about is, um, I guess in verse 11, where it says, I mean, not verse 11, verse 7, where it says, and when they had finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. This beast that rises from the bottomless pit, is that what we read in chapter 9?
Yeah. At some point, the angel that's given the key to the bottomless pit.
Yeah, that's in chapter 9. I mean, would you think that that's the bottomless pit that it's talking about?
The abyss? Yeah, I think that would be the same. Yeah, the thing that I don't get here, I mean, it already mentioned the Gentiles and them treading on the city 42 months. So who's this beast here? This beast is the one that kills the two witnesses. Like that happens in Jerusalem. Like that surely couldn't be Titus and the Roman armies that killed the two witnesses.
Well, if I could back up a little bit earlier, okay, so we have in verse 3, and I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days. Okay, so you've got two witnesses. Now, the Seventh-day Adventists believe that the two witnesses are the Old Testament and the New Testament. And they went through several imagery for that, but I don't see it exactly that way. I see that the two witnesses are the law and the prophets, because the two olive trees and the two lampstands, that's in Zephaniah, I believe, or Zechariah. But it says in verse 5, it says, and if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, this is exactly what happened during Elijah's time. So this is showing Elijah being the greatest prophet, that the prophet portion of the Old Testament, they had the power to shut the sky that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. That's exactly what the story of Elijah was about. And then right after that, it says, and they have the power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague. That's the law. That's what Moses did. So I think that these two witnesses are the law and the prophets, which are symbols, or you could say um, anthropomorphizing Moses and Elijah as those, two figures, but it's basically the Old Testament.
Yeah, I would have to, at my point in time right now, agree with that. Like, that's what makes the most sense to me. Like, who these people were wasn't like a literal like person.
Then why
But
was everybody? I mean, I'm in agreement, but why was everybody all happy about it?
everybody was what?
They were super happy when they died. Like when they're dead, when they went up or whatever. Like everybody was like, "Yes, hooray!"
Maybe it means like the believers left, the people that actually believed in Moses and the prophets. Because if you think about it, like if you go back to, so this is we would say this last 3.5 years, right?
Yeah,
Like
that's
how?
definitely the part where the Gentiles are like outside. I mean, it just said that in the beginning, right?
But you also have here. So if you just like go with it for a second. Um, so you have this 3.5 year period. Let me just look at something really quick. Uh, yeah, so this 3.5 year period, or this 42 and a half months, or 1,260 days, right? So if it starts talking about the the time period, because Jesus says, like, the believers will flee to the mountains. The people that are left in the city are those, mostly are just unbelievers. The believers left. Chapter 9 talks about how the scorpions, the Scorpio weapon thing, and 9 in Revelation 9:4, that says they were not to harm the grass of the earth, the green plants of the trees, but only the people who do not have the seal of God in their foreheads. So again, like, it seems like the Roman army could only attack people that weren't believers in God. Well, maybe it
Right.
seems like the believers of God were taken away, you could say. Like, they left the city during this 3.5 year period, and this is when the well, I don't know. I don't know how that would work then, because I'm just thinking that the law and the prophets were there during this time period. So the believers, it couldn't be believers preaching the words of the law and the prophets,
Right, right.
because
What
they're
it
in the city.
was they were killing the law and the prophets because they were misreading them,
Yeah, yeah, that makes.
Yeah. Okay.
and so that's what they were doing. And so when Jesus was showing them what the law and the prophets were actually saying, they couldn't stand it. They were sticking their fingers in their ears, and they were like, they just couldn't, because it was tormenting them.
True that.
And they were so happy when they had crucified Christ.
I know, but this is talking about the last 3.5 years. Would you say that?
I'm not sure if this would be a recapitulation of the whole ministry of Christ by him bearing witness of the law and the prophets, showing the two witnesses. Um, Even, Christ had said Elijah has already come. And what did John the Baptist do? John the Baptist quoted Isaiah, a prophet. So John was bearing witness to the prophet's testimony. So when Jesus has said Elijah has already come, I think that this chapter here is a overall recapitulation, maybe, of the ministry of Christ in a way.
I mean, because chapter 12 does the same thing. It goes back to the birth of Jesus.
Right. Okay. So then that would make sense to me, that this is just like the whole thing, from Jesus coming in on the scene to the destruction.
I know, but it's just weird that it says this 42-month period.
Well, isn't that in Daniel somewhere?
Yeah, chapter 12.
Who also is a prophet, who also is part of the two witnesses. And so it could be that the law and the prophets are working through the Christians, because remember, on the road to Emmaus, after he had risen, and then he showed them all the scriptures. He took them through the law and the prophets and showed them all the scriptures containing, referring to himself. So it's like, oh, now we get it. We understand. And so then the early Christian church were taking those scriptures that Christ had interpreted and shown them, and saying, these are the witnesses. These are the witnesses to Christ. These are the things that you should see. And it was tormenting the Pharisees all throughout that period in that time. And so their dead bodies in verse 8, were lying in the streets of the great city. That could be, in a way, saying that the way the Pharisees interpreted the law and the prophets were dead. In other words, that they were not witnesses to Christ being the Messiah. So to them, that whole idea of the law and the prophets bearing witness to this particular individual, they wouldn't recognize it, refused to. So it was like they did not see the life in the scriptures. So if you can't see the life in the scriptures, then the scriptures are dead to you.
Now, I'm trying to look here. Let me just do a Google search. Because sometimes, for some reason, my eSword, like when I put in a phrase, it doesn't really like catch it. Because Jesus says that the city says something very similar to the city being trampled underfoot by the Gentiles or something like that.
I know that's in
I think it's
Daniel
Luke.
or
I think it's
Isaiah.
Luke. No, I think it's something Jesus said, and I think it was
Okay.
in the Olivet Discourses. Let me go back to Revelation and kind of copy and paste. Man, I'm gonna just say, how do I word it? That's the thing. It's only gonna come up if the words match what Jesus said somewhat.
Okay, so one of the words is trampled. So
There is in Revelation 13 another 42 months. The beast was given a mouth to speak arrogant and blasphemous words and authority to act for 42 months.
Luke 21:24.
Yeah, here we go. Yep, that's it.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and they will fall by the mouth of the sword and will lead captivity to all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden down by nations until the times of the nations are fulfilled. So the thing is here is why it sounds like this revelation thing is talking about something future from the time of Jesus, like his ministry and things like that. So during the context of Luke 21 is, you know, the destruction of the city. You see my point?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to kind of fit here that if you look at verse 20 in Luke 21, it says, "And when you see Jerusalem being encircled by armies, then recognize that the destruction has come near. Let those in Judea flee into the mountains, and those in the midst let them not go out, and those who are in the villages let them not go into her. For these are the days of vengeance, when all things that have been written are to be fulfilled. But woe to the pregnant women and the ones nursing in those days, for great distress will be on the earth, and the wrath on its people, and they will fall by the mouth of the sword, and will be led captive to all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden down by the nations until the times of the nations are fulfilled." And again, that also brings in the fact of Romans 11, the time of the Gentiles, where Paul says in Revelation 11, obviously, Romans 11, he says, uh, verse 25, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that it may be that you may not be wise with yourselves, that hardness' part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the nations come in, and all the tribes of Israel will be saved. Even as it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away the iniquity of Jacob." So again, you kind of have like this until the Gentiles, until all this time period is fulfilled. And I would imagine that also includes the 70 AD thing until everything would be, the complete salvation, which would come to Israel which would be the 70 AD event.
Well,
Right.
what would you guys specifically say times of the Gentiles or nations is?
Well, the part in Romans 11, I mean,
Mhm.
I would just say it's until the time, again, I believe this millennial kind of period, until that period would be over and then all Israel would be saved,
Right, but
meaning,
what I mean is what does the because those two phrases are just worded differently, but I see them as identical.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. They're both talking about the same end
But what
goal
is
of
it?
Israel.
Like what
So,
is the times, like specifically
yeah,
not
the
when is
first
it,
century.
what is it?
Oh,
You know
the
what I mean?
message of the to bring in the Gentiles into Christ, and then during that time period would be the Jews coming to Christ,
I
and they
have
would,
another
or
interpretation.
yeah, let me hear it.
Um, I see the times of the Gentiles, like look at Luke 21 first. It'll be trodden down by the Gentiles till the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. It almost is telling you what the times of the Gentiles is. Remember the statue of Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and Rome. Those are Gentile nations having kind of control over Israel, and you could call that, if you're looking at it from Israel's standpoint, times of the Gentiles. So it could be saying that Jerusalem will be trodden down by those Gentiles until the times of those Gentiles are fulfilled. It kind of sounds crazy, but it's like, wherever you are, there you there you are. Like, but if you bring that over to Romans 11 and you look at it the same way, like um, it's it could basically be saying that all Israel, which is the Israel of God, right? Like everybody, true Israel, all believers who ever believe, um, that they'll be saved when that same time period ends. And that is 70 AD because that's the end of Daniel's prophecy with that's when the stone cut without hands smashes the statue at the feet. And now it's like, okay, Israel's done for, and this is the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled, and yet at the same time, it's the time where all Israel will now be saved because it's not just Jews anymore. Israel's done. So it almost sounds a little convoluted, but to my mind, it makes a lot of sense. I can't see what else the times of the Gentiles could be, because if you attribute it to a time where Gentiles are getting saved and you plug it in, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's why I brought up Luke 21 and
Right.
then Revelation 11 and Romans 11 and said they're
Mhm.
all talking about the same event,
Right.
because it is talking about the same event.
I
Israel
agree.
would be saved at the time
hmm
of the destruction of Israel, meaning I kind of take it as like it's actually talking about actual people of Israel, like all
Right.
those people who were actually bloodline Israelites, like all of them would be
Right.
saved.
But if you follow the context that Paul is trying to, the whole theme that Paul's going through in Romans 9 through 11, in fact, Romans 1 through 11, he's trying to tell you that there's no difference between the Jew and the Gentile. He's trying to tell you that all have sinned and fallen short. He's trying to
Yeah,
tell you
yeah,
what
no, of course,
he's
but
trying to tell you
he
that.
does make a distinction between, he says, talks about like my brothers according to the flesh.
Yeah, but he's making a distinction
Yeah, no, who's the true, like the
to get to
true
the true
son,
Israel. Right.
like who's the true Israel? But I kind of believe here in Romans 11, it's talking about actual like Israelites, like saying, hey,
I don't know how you would come to that conclusion after realizing that Paul is trying to bring the whole thing together into the true Israel. Like, not all Israel is Israel, Romans 9
yeah,
6.
no, of course, but again, he does make a distinction. Like there is a distinction in
Mhm.
the flesh, like
Right.
who's your daddy? Like, of course, like in Christ, it doesn't matter. We're all one. But there were Israelites that weren't in Christ at the time, and he's saying, hey, at the time of the fullness of the Gentiles, at that time, when that would come to an end, is when all those who are Israel, like that would come to Christ, are going to come to Christ. Like God, I mean, I believe he knew the future. He knew who the heck was going to be saved and who wasn't going to be saved, that it wasn't a surprise. So when he says here, all Israel will be saved, and the all means all those who are going to be saved, not every single person that was from the bloodline of Abraham.
Yeah, but how could he be saying that all Israel will be saved? And
Well, I
it's
mean,
how
that's what
could
it
it be
says
pertaining?
there.
I know your point. Like you're saying, it's pertaining to fleshly Israel, but not all of them. Just all
Yeah,
the
all the
true
ones. Yeah,
Israel
all the ones
within
that would be
Israel.
saved, because he distincts Israel's and Gentiles. He says, "Hey, all Israel will be saved," and then he literally says, "Until the time of the Gentiles come in." Well,
But
if the Gentiles are Israel, then why is he making a distinction between the
because
two?
he's using the term Israel. Like if you go to Romans 9:6 and it says not all Israel is Israel,
Mm-hmm.
there's two words Israel in the same sentence, so they can't be the same thing.
No, but the context of 9, he actually says, he talks about this the seed or the descendants of the children of promise. So he
Right,
makes a
which is not
distinction.
of the flesh.
But now you're saying in Romans chapter 11 that
Right?
the Israel here and the Gentiles are the same group, right?
No.
So then, oh wait,
No, I'm
so didn't?
saying that all Israel in Romans 11,
Mm-hmm.
when he says, and so, I mean, he just got done going over and over and over again how if you want to be a child of Christ, Abraham's seed,
But wait a second.
you
So
have
verse
to be
25.
a believer.
So you're saying, and I get your point. Israel in Romans 11 and 25 and 26
Hmm.
is, the Jew circumcised on the inside.
Correct.
Okay, so who are the hardness has happened until Israel? Who's that Israel?
Okay, that's exactly what he's talking about. He's going back to Isaiah chapter 6. He says, hardening has happened or
Yeah,
blindness has
yeah.
happened.
But again, is that talking about the nation of Israel, or is that talking
Yes,
about believers?
the
So,
nation.
okay, so again, I think we're in agreement here.
Hmm.
25 is talking about national Israel. It's talking about peoples whose daddy is Abraham.
Right.
Okay, that's my point. And then when you look at the next verse,
Hmm.
again, he says, all the tribes of Israel will be saved. So, me, in the context
Well, he
there,
doesn't say tribes. He says all Israel will be saved.
yeah, my Bible probably just adds that there, which I hate really. I'm getting sick
But
and
that
tired of
would,
this
if it
Bible.
said that, then I would never say that it's all Israel, meaning spiritual Israel, because it's talking about tribes, which is genetic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even if the Bible doesn't say tribes, and I would agree that it most likely doesn't, because my Bible is a Hebraic roots Bible, and he definitely loves to add words there and not let me know where he's adding it. So that's why I hate this Bible with a
But
passion.
what I'm trying to say that like you have a differentiation in the same verse
Yeah, yeah. I'm not
in Romans
disagreeing.
9:6.
I'm not disagreeing, but I just don't see the point in the sense of saying that.
All right, let me just say
And
one thing before
mhm.
you dismiss it, because what I think is happening is if you go to Isaiah 6, God tells Isaiah
Yeah,
for
I
the
know
future.
Isaiah 6, and
Right, right.
I get all that.
But
But
he
what?
tells him when the blindness is going to end, Zach,
Yeah, yeah,
and it
in the
correlates with
fullness.
11.
Yeah, the
Why would
destruction.
there be a remnant of a whole thing, though?
But listen, before I answer that, Isaiah 6, Isaiah says to God about the blindness, how long? And he tells him until the city be destroyed and without inhabitant and desolate. Right? So now God is telling Isaiah, Israel's going to be blind. It's almost parallels Romans 11 exactly. He tells him Israel's going to be blind until it's destroyed. How could something be blind when it no longer exists? So Israel as a nation will be blinded until it's done away with. And once it's done away with, that's the salvation of all nations. I mean, you guys believe that. You're full of preterists.
Yeah, no, and I'm in agreement. Of course, if you're dead, you obviously you can't see regardless, anyways. So you're blind until
Right.
I shoot you in the head, and then now you're just dead. I see that, and I agree with that. But again, I just see that there is a distinction in, because it, like, the way I read it, it just flows naturally. It just flows that, okay, so you have Israel, the nation of Israel. Their heart, their hardening, the hardening part of Israel has happened to Israel until the fullness of the nation has come in. Okay, because the nations, that's the Gentiles. Those are the ones. Obviously, they're all going to be saved in the end. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess in your understanding. So I see your point. You have Israel, and then you have nations. And when it says all Israel will be saved, it's just combining the nations and Israel as
Correct.
one. Great, I got
That's
you.
what I see.
Yeah.
Now, so the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, could that be the hand of God executing judgment by using Gentile non-believers to execute judgment to Israel? Or do you see the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled as Gentiles coming into the kingdom?
No,
Or
neither. I
both?
see the times of the Gentiles as those Gentile nations that were talked about: Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and Rome. Rome is the last Gentile power that is in the prophecy, and
I see.
Rome, um, even though Rome continues for a couple of hundred years, technically, the stone cut without hands strikes the statue at the feet, crumbles the whole thing down, and then the mountain, continues. The stone continues to grow into a great mountain, and that's
Right.
a
So,
little unexplainable,
well, I mean,
That's funny.
so it is
right?
one of the two categories that I listed. Then the Gentiles being the non-believing ones that execute judgment, because he used the Babylonians to execute judgment. He used the Gentiles for that. So that's in a period of the times of the Gentiles,
Right.
just like the Persians, just like the Greeks, and now the Romans. So he's using, and those are the times of the Gentiles. And so when the Romans finish their last strike, which destroyed the temple, that concluded the times of the Gentiles.
Yes,
Uh,
and in Revelation, that is the beast that turns on the woman. See, the woman rides the beast. The woman is Israel, who's riding on the back of the beast until the beast, Rome, turns on the woman and destroys her, and that's
Right.
70 AD.
yeah,
I
and now
agree.
I can see the point with the because you have Revelation chapter 11 talking about at the the after the 3.5 years, or at that period of time, is when you have these time periods, and then you have the trotting underfoot of the
Hmm.
temple of the nations. And then also when you look at Luke 11 or Luke 21, that's the context, is when you see Israel surrounded by armies.
Those Gentiles, right?
Yeah, so and that's what makes sense. That's why when we were talking about Revelation 11, I went to Luke 21, and then I went to Romans 11, because it just fits. Like, that's just what makes sense.
Oh yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, that's immediately what I think of is Luke 21 and Romans 11. But I also add Isaiah 6, because that's when they were told initially that they're going to be blinded, and Isaiah asks how long, and God tells
Yeah,
them when the city's destroyed.
yeah, until they're dead.
But yeah, you guys were talking Luke 21:24, but the verse right above and the verse right below are actually like, how miserable will those days be for the pregnant and nursing mothers, right? That sounds similar to like immediately after the tribulation of those days. And then, in 25, Luke 21:25, it says, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars on the earth this May. Same as the sun will turn to blood, and I mean, the sun
Yeah, the
will turn black,
seventh.
and the moon will turn
Yeah,
to blood, and the stars will fall, like all that again. So it's all the same time
exactly.
period.
And wow, what you just said, because it makes a lot of sense. Because going back to this recapitulation thing of Revelation, you have the sixth seal, where you have the sun being blackened, you have the earthquake, you have like all this like crazy stuff
Mhm.
going on. At the end of Revelation 11, you have the seventh trumpet, the judgment of the dead and the righteous, all that stuff happening. And then also in Revelation 11:13, there was a great earthquake, you know, and a lot of people were killed, and so you have all this, like, it's just all that should just make so much sense. It's all talking about the same event, 70
Yep.
AD.
Yep.
You know, that's the coming of
Or
the Lord.
somewhere around that time period, or somewhere in the past.
Yeah, give or take. Yeah, with Albert's new
Oh, no,
understanding.
that's funny. I was just laughing because of our pre-conversation, but the part where you were just saying like I don't know. Matthew just said something where he was like, I don't get how that works because the Roman Empire went on for so long afterwards. It's like,
Yeah.
but did it? Did it?
Mm-hmm. I was gonna say that too. Like maybe it really didn't. They just made up some fake history.
So there is no
Because it
Pope?
does seem to drop off on that chart right after Trajan.
Yeah, Rob. I don't know if you were here, but there's a thing where everybody's
Yeah,
on acid right now, and when they say about the Pope, we're all just like, "Woo, the Pope!"
yeah. I heard. I saw Albert's chart. I didn't see it, but I listened in on it. And
Yeah,
the popes that have been happening all since back then have actually just been the same person.
yeah. It's all just we're all on. That's what I said. Like, what kind of mushrooms are we all on?
But Zach, one more thing before we
Mm-hmm.
go on to. I just thought of something. I didn't turn to Romans 11, but I just thought that word that Paul uses, and so all
Mm-hmm.
Israel will be saved. I don't know if you've ever looked at it.
No, I haven't,
It
but I
basically
could.
means and in this manner.
I
So
got you.
so he goes
No,
through
I
this.
see your interpretation, and definitely because when you look at the verse before it, what was it, 25? Uh, Yeah, let those be wise in our own sight. I understand the mystery, brothers, that partial hardening has happened to Israel. So you have Jews
Right.
until the Gentiles has come in. Then he just, like he does before, the true believers are Israel. So when you just say Israel, it means like spiritual Israel. Like who is the true Israel? Galatians 4. It's the son of the promise, not the son of the slave woman.
Right. And Luke
And this was the way
21.
all Israel will be saved. As the deliverer will come forth at Zion. He will banish the ungodliness of Jacob. Again, Jacob is Israel. So I see your
Right.
point, and I
Right.
actually like
Right.
that better. So thank
Luke
you.
21 kind of interprets Romans 11 because it tells you what the fullness or the times of the Gentiles is by saying that it's going to be trodden down by
Yeah,
the Gentiles.
if we didn't have that little tidbit by Luke, oh my gosh, we would be so.
Right, right, right.
Yeah, I mean that is actually true. It's not mentioned in the other ones, Matthew and Mark.
That's what the dispensationals and the futurists.
The
Like,
abomination
see,
of
this is gonna be like that happens. Like, but like right there in Luke, it tells you exactly what it is.
But I have other interesting things in Revelation 11. Um, so if we go to Revelation 11, I mean I know we all hold to this understanding anyways, but verse 8 is one of the best verses to kind of show who Babylon is.
oh yeah,
So if you look at it, it says, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city. So again, so we want to find out, what is this great city? Well, if you look at Jeremiah chapter 22, so if you go to Jeremiah 22, verses 6 through 9, hold on, where is it? It's actually just 6 and 8, actually. But it says, so Jeremiah 22, verse 6 through 8 says, for thus says the Lord concerning the house of the king of Judah, you are like Gilead, and to me, like the summit of Lebanon, and yet surely I will make you a desert and an uninhabitable city. I will prepare destroyers against you, each with his weapon, and they shall cut you down, your choice cedars, and cast them into the fire. And many nations will pass by this city, and every man will say to his neighbor, why has the Lord dealt with this great city? So again, Jerusalem here is called a great city. Then you go back to Revelation 11, and it says, so this great city, which is symbolically or spiritually called Sodom. So where in the Bible, if we would say Jerusalem is called Sodom, we believe that. Where is that at? Well, Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 1 says, the vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Uzziah, Hezekiah, the king of Judah. So again, this prophecy, everything that he's writing to is about Judah and Jerusalem. You go to verse 10, and it says, "Hear the words of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the teaching of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of your burnt offerings and rams and your fat of well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or the lambs of goats." When, oh yeah, that's pretty much, but yeah, it says Sodom and Gomorrah. So there you go. You got your Sodom. Then it talks about Egypt, that it's also called spiritual Egypt. Well, when you go to Galatians 4, it talks about the two covenants, and it calls them Jerusalem, obviously. But it says here in Galatians 4:21, it says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, you do not listen to the law, for it is written, Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by the free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born according to the promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children of slavery. She is Hagar." So again, we have the two Jerusalem, the slave and the free, and the slave one is from Hagar. Well, who's Hagar? Well, Genesis 25, verse 12. Genesis 25, verse 12 says, "These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham." So again, we have here an allegory which correlates the first, I guess you could say, the first Jerusalem, or the earthly Jerusalem, which was in slavery during the time that Paul wrote Galatians, which was called, or their mother was Hagar, the
The
Egyptian,
firstborn.
the firstborn, Hagar, which was the Egyptian. So we have Jerusalem being called biblically the great city, or a great city. We have it being called spiritually Sodom. We have it spiritually or allegorically called Egypt. Another interesting one is in Revelation, where 21, I believe, where the new city, or the new heaven, is actually called a great city. The Jerusalem coming down. So you can see, like, Jerusalem itself is called a great city. I'm not really sure exactly what verse it is, but don't quote me on that one. But again, so we definitely have the great city, Jerusalem. We have, Sodom, Jerusalem, and then Egypt, Jerusalem. And then what does the next verse, the part of the verse say? Where our Lord was crucified. That obviously means Rome. So, yeah.
How is Sodom Jerusalem? I kind of missed that part. I heard what you said.
Yeah, so what I was saying, Revelation 11, verse 8. So you have, did you hear the part of the great city?
Yeah, I heard everything. I got Hagar and being from Egypt, but I don't get why Jerusalem would be called Hagar, I guess.
Well, no, because Paul says in Galatians 4, he compares he compares the two covenants. I'll just read it one more time. So in Galatians 4:21, if you want to go there, I'm reading the ESV. So Galatians 4:21 says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it was written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and one by the free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through the promise." Now, this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children of slavery. She is Hagar. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. So we have the first woman, the flesh one, which is called Hagar. She's the mother of the present Jerusalem, meaning, in my understanding, would be talking about like the first century, the Jewish nation. It talks about Mount Sinai. You have the Mosaic covenant. So the people that were under the first covenant that didn't believe in Jesus, they were in slavery to the old covenant, that they were under Hagar. They were under the Egyptian woman. While the Christians, you can see in verse 26 of Galatians, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see, like, the Christians, they were in the heavenly Jerusalem. They were in that spiritual Jerusalem. That was their mother. While the Jews in the first century, their mother was Hagar. So again, the writer of Revelation, John, he says in verse 11:8, he says, she is symbolically called Sodom and Egypt. So I think what I just showed was that you could show that Jerusalem, the physical Jerusalem in the first century, was Hagar. Well, that was their mother. So, and I don't know if you got this part, but if you go to Genesis 25, verse 12, it tells us who Hagar was. And Genesis 25, verse 12 says, these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. So right there, it correlates Hagar being the Egyptian.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go back, you obviously kind of connect all that together. So Jerusalem is in Egypt. Is Egypt.
Egypt. I want to add to what you said too, Zach, because
Yeah.
That older younger brother theme that runs throughout the Bible is showing. Israel is called multiple, like you just proved. It's called multiple of the pagan nations. It's even called Edom in Malachi.
Yeah.
Indirectly, though. But my point about Hagar is that Ishmael is the first. Paul uses Ishmael as the son of the bondwoman, and when he's talking about getting rid of the law and the people of the law, so cast out the woman and her son.
Yep.
So that's the older brother, but that also carries over to Jacob and Esau exactly in the same way. And Paul quotes from Malachi in Romans 9 when he's trying to prove, like what we just talked about before, that there's a reversal going on. In theme, I mean, we know like all the Jews weren't cast out and then all the Gentiles get saved. It's just a theme that the thing goes from old covenant to new covenant, Jew to Gentile, just in theme. We know there's Jews who get saved and we know there's Gentiles who don't. But the older and younger brother theme carries through. And in Malachi, it starts off with, the burden of the word of the Lord to Israel, or Malachi, and he says, I have loved you, talking about, Israel. But wasn't Esau Jacob's brother, says the Lord, yet Jacob I have loved, and Esau I have hated. But the chapter continues to go on about the destruction of Israel and how Gentiles will be saved. It mentions Gentiles twice in the rest of that chapter. So when Paul quotes Malachi, Jacob I loved and Israel and Esau I've hated in Romans 9, he's simply bringing that older, younger brother theme into Romans 9 to try and prove that there was a reversal now or a switch from Jew to Gentile, and the older brother is cast aside and the younger brother gets saved. And that's what Jesus is talking about in the parable of the prodigal son. He's trying to, that series of parables in Luke 15 and 16. Jesus is indirectly telling the Jews, you're doomed. So the older brother, he doesn't want to rejoice that the younger brother is going to get saved. And that's what happens. See, the older brother gets angry and jealous, exactly like God's told Moses in the Song of Moses would happen. And that's why Paul quotes the Song of Moses in Romans 10, trying to show that Israel is now getting angry and jealous by a foolish nation. The Song of Moses is coming to pass. All of it, to show that there's this switch. It's like Albert said before, the parables are all about the same thing. But I just wanted to bring up that older, younger brother, and the fact that Israel is also called Edom. It's indirectly. It's like God's telling them, "You're just like the pagan nations. You're no better."
Yeah, definitely. I like all that stuff for sure. I mean, again, it's just more proof of like the time period of when this stuff was happening. The New Testament is clear that it's like now it's time making way. The old Jerusalem, the old way is, obsolete. It's nearly about to be destroyed. And that's what Revelation is talking about, the destruction of the city.
Right. Yeah.
And then it finishes, where our Lord was crucified.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, that's definitely Jerusalem. Jesus even says like a prophet can't even like die outside of Jerusalem. So I mean, definitely pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty wild how all of these things. I mean, when you see all these things in different places come together, it truly is amazing. And you think like, I mean, look, us guys have been studying the Bible for so long, and we just nobody could ever tell us that, that this thing is not true, and we can't even fathom it not being true. But when you see how it's like a writer, it's like a genius writer who writes this long movie, and all these pieces of the puzzle like will fit together, but
Like Memento.
it's so complicated,
Just like Memento. You got to play it backwards to get it.
Yeah, that movie's
Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah, something like that, where it's like it's like so complicated. It's like really one person just made all this up. Like, there's
right.
a couple guys working on this for sure. I mean,
But the funny thing is, even it's so complicated in the history and the various players in the whole thing, and yet it's all saying one thing. The whole theme is you have to get saved by faith and not law. That's the
Yeah.
whole thing.
yeah,
There's a new way. It's definitely the new covenant. Like you have to leave the old. Like a Gentile has to leave his pagan Gentile ways or his. I mean, I'm pretty sure there was probably atheists back then too, or however you believed. That's a religion in itself too. But you had to leave those ways and come to Christ. Or if you were a Jew, you would have to leave Judaism, and that's why Paul says that was in slavery.
Mm-hmm.
They were under that veil. They had to come out from under it and come into Christ to have life. And like again, like it's at this, again, I would go back to Daniel and say like it's at the destruction of the city. It's at the coming of the Lord and all this
Right.
stuff. That's when the power of the holy people would be completely shattered. That would be the time of all that stuff.
Well, you know how many times Isaiah 6 is quoted by both Jesus and Paul? It's quite a few. And the book of Acts is about that 40-year period where that I say is in between the two halves of Daniel's 70th week. I say
Yeah.
there's a 40-year interval. It's a time of Israel's testing, and just a couple of years before its destruction, Acts 28, Paul quotes Isaiah 6 for the last time after preaching to them all day, and he just says, Isaiah spoke well of you. You're blind.
Yeah, no, I definitely see. I kind of hold to the millennial period being at that time. So for me, like Daniel, chapter 9, like that's what's not spoken about. You have the death of Christ, but then all of a sudden you have the destruction, no millennial period. In my view, I know you don't hold to that view, but it
Right.
just fits good in my perspective. That's the part that's missing, that 40-year period.
Yeah, it's a kind of I've never heard anybody else say that there's a 40-year gap between the first and second half of Daniel. It just hit me one day that and to me the 70 weeks is the history of Israel. It's like when Daniel was praying, what's going to come of my people Israel? God tells him the answer. Well, this is what's going to happen to them. This is their whole period from the time of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until its very end. This is the history, and he gives them the time frame, but then it's like there's a little gap there between the first and second half. If Jesus's ministry at his baptism begins the first 3.5, and he's crucified in the midst of the week, then there's 40 years. Then you have the second half. Josephus tells us that the siege is exactly 3.5 years long. In my mind, that has got to be the second half of Daniel's week, finishing out the 70 weeks prophecy and the end of Israel. So what's the 40 years? It's just a gap. That's all it is. It's a space. It's a transitional space where Israel, true Israel within Israel can believe before its destruction and get out, and Gentiles can also get saved at the same time. I don't know how else, I wouldn't call it the millennium, of course, but
I don't really see that. Yeah, I don't see a gap there. I mean, I think it's all one continuous thing too. But
yeah, but then it would be then the 70th, the last year would be a year plus 40, a year plus 40, and that wouldn't work time wise, because the siege is 3.5 years, the ministry of Jesus is 3.5 years, because we know Jesus is crucified in the midst. That's for sure.
yeah, in the midst of the week, but isn't there that like 7? So 7. It's like not exactly like what is it? 490 years total
It's
from
490, right? It's
He
483.
isn't crucified in the midst of the week.
right, and so
You're
and then
reading
so
that
there's
wrong.
Why isn't? What do you mean? Of course, he's crucified in the midst of the week.
No, read it again.
You're talking about Daniel 9?
Yeah.
All right, let's go to Daniel 9. So 70 weeks are determined. That's total. He lists basically 6 things that are going to be accomplished. Right? He says when the streets will be built again in troublous times. And after 62 weeks, right? Now, after 62 weeks, that's 62 weeks. That's all of.
You have to include the other week as well, so it's actually 69 weeks.
Right. So right after 62 weeks plus the 7, which you're right, which makes it after the 69 weeks, Messiah is cut off. Okay.
Right.
So we know that.
Where does it say in the midst of the week? That
Okay.
doesn't say that anywhere.
Well, 27 says,
27. Keep going.
He shall make strong a covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to the sacrificing and offering.
Yeah, that's the last week, though. That's the week that's
in the midst
Revelation.
in the midst of the last week is the middle of the week. That's when he causes the sacrifice and oblation to cease.
Yeah, that's when the temple was destroyed. After the 3.5 years or 42 months.
And then that's the one, and on the wing of the
People always
abomination shall
combine
come.
27 with 25, but they're two separate things.
In my mind, Jesus causes the sacrifice and oblation that Israel had been doing for so long to cease. And then, for their abominations, he makes it desolate. But that takes place 3.5 years later.
Yeah, but what's interesting is, I guess, the way it's like in the order here. If this is like a sequential order from like 24, I mean, 24 is kind of like the overall like heading, like what's going to be accomplished within the 70 weeks. But then 25, 26, 27, it breaks the weeks down of what's going to be done during those weeks.
Right.
So I can definitely see Rob's point for sure,
Right.
in
Well,
the sense of the sacrifices and offering truly ended, like physically, when the destruction of the temple happened.
And it's
So-
also it's the
It kept
prince
going.
that shall come and destroy the city that confirms the covenant for 1
So,
week.
so hang on. When do you think that Jesus confirmed the new covenant with many? When was the actual confirmation?
That's so you're reading it wrong. It's not Christ that's doing the covenant in 1 week.
Who is
It's
it?
the people, the prince that shall come and destroy the city for 1 week.
Wait. No. I'm talking about Daniel 9:27a. He shall confirm the
Yeah,
covenant.
he is the people, the prince.
Oh gosh, no.
Well, the
Yeah.
prince, I believe, is the Messiah, the anointed one.
No, the prince is Titus.
Well, in verse 25 it says, "Know therefore and understand that the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, and the coming of the anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, then 62 weeks, and he shall build again."
Yours
the
doesn't
square.
say Messiah, the prince, though, in
Well, no, it's the
25.
anointed one
And then
is
it's
the
people
Messiah.
of the prince in 26.
Rob,
And
in Matthew 26:28, Jesus says, This is my blood of the new covenant which is shed for many. Right? So Jesus is saying, I'm about to shed the blood of the new covenant for many. What does Daniel 9:27 say then? It says, He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. That's Christ.
Well,
you
I
could
mean, I
take it
can
either
see,
way, but it's
yeah,
Titus that's doing the work.
I see
Titus is
your
in there.
point. Like it does definitely say, and the people of the prince
That's an
who is
interjection.
to come shall destroy the city. Again, that's 70 AD.
Right. How is
Destroy the
he
city.
people? He is singular.
Yeah, then you get to 27 and it says, and he shall make strong a covenant. So the only singular he is got to be the anointed one. But again, if hypothetically speaking, in Rob's interpretation, Titus would be like, you could say, Jesus's hand.
Exactly.
Like even God says that about Nebuchadnezzar. He's an instrument in my hand.
Yeah, I get that. But now listen, look at what Romans 15:8 says. Now I say that Jesus Christ has become a servant to the circumcision for the truth of God to confirm the promises made to the fathers.
Yeah, to make true, to
Who
establish.
confirms the covenant with the blood shed for many? And when does he do it? It's Christ and his blood, and he does it in the midst of the week. I think
Well,
it's pretty
I mean,
clear.
also, like in my understanding, like because it's kind of like not hard to explain, but like for me, like there was 2 covenants at the same time, pretty much. Not one was, it's not, one mouth of God saying, "Oh
Right.
yeah, I'm Jewish now," and then another one's, "Oh no, well, I'm actually Christian. Just don't tell anybody."
There's that overlap.
Yeah, it's like an overlap. So technically, like for me, Revelation, the consummation of the ages, the marriage supper of the Lamb, all that stuff is when the old covenant was completely destroyed to
Right.
bring in fully the new. So with
Let me
Rob's
read you
interpretation, I can kind of see
the
that.
easy reading version, how they put it. Daniel 9:26. After 62 weeks, the chosen one will be killed. He'll be gone. And the people of the future leader will destroy the city and the holy place. And the end will come like a flood. The war will continue until the end. God has ordered that place to be completely destroyed. Then the future ruler will make an agreement with many people that the agreement will continue for 1 week. The offering and sacrifice will stop for half a week. And the destroyer will come. He'll do terrible, destructive things, but God has ordered the destroyer to be completely destroyed.
Wow, that doesn't even make sense to
That
me.
doesn't make sense. Listen, I think
No, the future leader is Titus.
Hey, Rob, let me throw something out there to you. If you look at Daniel 9:26, there's a part A and a part B. My contention is that part B is not sequential. You have to take part B. In other words, eliminate part B for a minute and just read 9:26 and then go right to 27 without reading and the people of the prince, and you're going to see how it makes sense. It says, and
But
after
then you would have to say that it's talking backwards.
No, it does, because look, the Bible,
because you're putting 26a with 27 and skipping an event that happens 40
no, I'm
years
not skipping
later.
an event. The event and the people of the prince that shall come is something that shall happen.
That's what I said, 40 years later.
Right, 40 years later. But right now, if you just read,
But the 927 is the last week of Daniel, though, which you agreed is in the future.
Is in the future? No,
I don't. You said that the last week there was a gap.
There was a gap.
This 927 is talking about the last week. If you say otherwise, then there's no mention of the last week.
I'm not sure what your point is.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Think about this.
Earlier.
If you say that this is when Christ came in his first coming, then you have to say there's no mention of the last week anywhere.
Well, sure that it's mentioning the last week and what's going on in the middle, because my point is what's happening in Daniel 9:26b is a quick thing of, and this is going to happen.
So
let's get back to the
was 3.5 years with Christ and then 3.5 years in 70 AD.
That's right.
Okay.
Also, you're saying that the gap is between. So in the 70th week, the gap is
between the two parts of it.
I see your gap. Yeah, I think the gap that I understand is the 69 and the 70th week.
Oh no, I see the 69.
You didn't really make that clear, but now I get where you're coming from.
I see the 69 week going right into the 70th. Jesus' baptism begins the 70th week. And that's what the whole point was about to Daniel. It was to tell him when the Messiah was coming. That's why the wise men from the east knew when it was going to be. But if you read 9:26, just for a moment, just play this thing out for me for a moment. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. See, that is a flow of what it would be. But when you go
you could definitely take it that way as well. I don't see any issue with that.
I think that's what makes Daniel 9, this whole thing, so confusing. It's that little interjection, just like the book of Revelation does. It doesn't go consecutive. Because if after 62 weeks, now that's the 69th week, and it's saying after the 69th week, Messiah will be cut off. So at least you know that much. He's not going to be cut off during the 69th week. He's going to be crucified definitely after the 69th week. But then it says in 27, but he's going to confirm the covenant in the midst of the week. He'll cause the sacrifice. Now it's telling you he's sacrificed in the middle. So the middle is after the 69th. So in other words, 3.5 years into the 70th week is when Jesus is crucified in the midst of the week. I also believe he was crucified in the middle of the regular week on a Wednesday.
Well, that's another. You went too far.
That's another.
Yeah, he was cut off in the middle, right? He was cut off in the midst of the week, or right?
Jesus was definitely crucified on Wednesday, Aviv 14. There's no question about it. I can prove that.
No, I meant the other thing, like the 70th week.
We've already talked about that multiple times.
Right. We've talked about that. But I think here it's saying that he's crucified in the midst of Daniel's last week.
Right. The 70th week, in the middle of the week. And so how long is a week?
7 years.
No, I mean how long in the prophecy? Isn't there like the whole thing about 490 years, like 7 times 7,
It's 70 times 7.
or whatever it is? Yes. Wait, 70 times 7. Okay, so
It's just like when Jesus said
right.
to
So
Peter, how
okay.
many times, Peter asked, how many times should I forgive? And Jesus alluded to Daniel 9,
Right, but how many
70 times 7.
how many years is 1 week then?
7.
7.
It's Shabuah. The word is Shabuah, which means a set
So
of 7.
the last week is 7. Is
7 years.
he's cut off. No, I mean I had something worked out. It was like the 40-year gap, but I guess I have the maths wrong or something.
Yeah, it is. It is definitely.
But it made
it's
sense for a second there. He was cut off in the middle. That's the middle of the last week, leaving only the rest of the last week to go, which was the last 40-ish years or whatever.
Right. So when I came to that conclusion, and then I read that Josephus calls out the the siege to be 3.5 years, I thought, well, man, that's got to be the second half of, and then it ends in 70 A.D. Isn't that a coincidence? Daniel's 70th week ends in the year 70.
Mm-hmm.
That's Israel's history, ends in the year 70. And that's the salvation of the nations. That's why Jesus said, how many times should I forgive? 70 times 7. That's where forgiveness is. Daniel's 70th week. With the crucifixion. I don't know if I'm stretching it there, but
I was just looking if
Also, the midst doesn't have to mean middle, though, does it?
then
it actually does, I think.
Christ's statement of 46 years to this temple doesn't really work out if you have him crucified in the midst of the week instead of 69 weeks.
What do you mean?
Because the temple was, according to history, it was restored and rebuilt in 20 BC and 19 BC. And Christ said it had been 46 years right around after he was baptized at that wedding. And it wouldn't be 46 years then if the way it works out. He would have to be crucified at the 69th week after the 69, not 69 and then a half a week. That's why I put the
how long do you believe?
How
long do you believe Jesus' ministry was?
How long do I believe it was?
From baptism
it was from
to
3.5
crucifixion.
years.
All right, so you don't think if Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years, you don't think that's the first half of Daniel's 70th week?
Nah, I think the week was the whole war from 66 to 73 AD.
"26." It does sound that's when he shall be cut off, right? And after the 62 weeks,
which is 69.
Right.
Yeah.
All the math works out perfectly. If he's at 69, it doesn't work out if it's, I mean, all the other statements, and then the way
most people believe that way too. Like he's cut off in the 26th, like the 69th week, and then like the 2,000-year gap is the 70th week.
But that's dispensationalism.
Yeah, but I mean, in the sense,
that's the church age.
I mean, in the sense, it's like most people see Jesus dying in the 69th week.
But it says he dies after.
Well, the thing is, it says, I
It's
guess you
still
could say, and
after, if it's 1 second after 69 years.
Oh yeah, but I'm going by Daniel 9:27
yeah,
that he
That's why I think
crucified. And,
you're taking Daniel 9:27. I get the idea, but
yeah.
it's the temple being destroyed, I believe, because, like I said, the math can't work out.
Now, Rob, what about the whole idea that Israel has like 40 years of testing in the wilderness? Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days, 400 years in Egypt. Israel's time of testing has to do with the number 40. And
Mm-hmm.
there's 40 years in between the ministry of Jesus and the beginning of the siege. And the siege lasts 3.5 years.
I would put the 40 years in between his crucifixion and the destruction of temple.
Well, you have to. That's obvious. But what I'm saying is, how do you line that up with Daniel's whole 70th week?
yeah. The 70th week is the destruction. The gap of the 40 years is in between 26 and 27, not in between part A and B of 27.
All right. Well, I mean, I see it as in between the first and second half of the 70th week.
Yeah, I got you. So
And
we're
I
pretty
see
much
it as an interval.
the only difference is so when does part B start in 27?
Part B is you mean of Daniel
27.
9:26?
Because
It
the
says, and he
problem,
shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. Is that part A and then part B? And
Well, here's the tricky part. It
I
says
think
he'll
if we
make a
take
covenant.
step back, it'd be a little easier. Go back to 25, because it says, the street shall be built again, the wall even in troublous times. That's what Jesus was referring to. It had been 46 years from that time. So that's when things were rebuilt in Jerusalem. So it's 62 weeks till then, which is 434 years, which has to be 20 BC or 19 BC for Christ to be right about the 46 years. If we put him being crucified in the midst of the week, then all those things can't be true.
But Rob, when it says, there's another interjection right there in 25b, when it says the street shall be built again, it's describing part, because it breaks it up into 3 segments, the timing. So first he starts off, know and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, 62 weeks. That's 69 weeks. But now it's going.
No. It's the time to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah shall be 69 weeks. But
Yes.
from the street shall be built again is only 62 weeks.
Exactly. So that little interjection actually goes backwards and just describing what's going to happen when it's rebuilt. Not describing when the Messiah is going to come. It's describing.
No, yeah.
You see what I'm saying? It's a little interjection. You can't just follow this whole thing as if it's chronological, because it's not. In my opinion, it's broken up.
I think it is chronological, though, to some aspect.
It's
but
like,
I definitely get your point.
Yeah, it's like when you're saying something, but you interrupt yourself
Mm-hmm.
and then you go back to what you were saying. That's all that's happening there. And you could see it in my version here, what I'm reading now, the King James version. There's a little colon right before the street shall be built again, and then it's the same thing with 26b, and the people of the prince that shall come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. Like, I don't take those as part of the chronology.
Why would the people of Christ come and destroy the city?
God calls Rome his armies. So that's one way to look at it. God is sending his servants to destroy the city.
Well, the prince to come, like he was a prince. It was Titus. Vespasian.
Right.
Vespasian was the emperor.
But didn't Christ already come?
I think the people of the prince that shall come, whether prince is a good translation or not, is talking about the Romans. The people are the Romans.
My point, that this is Titus.
They'll destroy the city, right?
Shall come, shall destroy the city.
Right. But then if you think
we're only like a few words apart.
Right.
Like you put the break in between, and he shall make strong a covenant with many for 1 week. Bam, and then there's a 40-week period or a 40-year period, or maybe
Now,
a little bit after that.
Zach, let me ask you about your translation. You say he shall make a strong covenant, right, with many?
Yeah, it's ESV.
I think that's a very bad translation for this reason. Um,
Let's see what the Greek says.
Christ doesn't make a covenant. He's simply confirming the Abrahamic covenant on the cross.
Yeah, see, the Greek even says strengths. And he
Right.
shall strengthen covenant with many.
Okay, but it doesn't mean that he's making it. It means that he's strengthening, he's enforcing it. He's confirming it, which
Yeah,
is not a bad way to look
yeah.
at it, but he's not making it from scratch. Like
I mean, in the sense, it is. I mean, it's a new covenant. It's
How
not
about
like the
let's
old
read
one.
the Septuagint? I think it gives a little better
mhm.
description, and I think it's going to make it more clear that this is Titus. Let's just start in 25. And thou shalt know.
Are you using a Brenton? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm in the Brenton.
Okay.
You there?
Mm-hmm.
And thou shalt know and understand from the going forth of the command for the answer for the building of Jerusalem until Christ the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And then time shall return, and the street shall be built, and the wall and the time shall be exhausted. After the 62 weeks, the anointed one shall be destroyed, and there is no judgment in him. He shall destroy the city and the sanctuary with the prince that is coming. They shall be cut off with a flood, and to the end of the war, which is rapidly completed, he shall appoint the city to desolations. In 1 week shall establish the covenant with many, and in the midst of the week my sacrifice and drink offering shall be taken away, and on the temple shall be the abomination of desolations, and the end of time and shall be put to desolation. So it puts the midst of the week being when the temple abomination of desolations, which I believe Luke described as the army surrounding Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So
And here
what
it says the
covenant?
prince that is coming.
What covenant is Titus making with many?
The covenant is being established that that God said there would be 7-year war.
But that's not a covenant.
Or, I mean, if you wanted to say, I think anything is an agreement, if God gives an agreement, he gives his word. Or you could say that Titus was making army deals with other people to destroy Jerusalem.
See,
Because
there's
there was
one
several nations coming against Jerusalem.
right.
It wasn't just the Romans.
See, let me just look for a moment at this. I noticed these words that simple little words that recur, like many, right? So think of Joseph's coat of many colors, and in the coat of many colors, the coat was doused in blood to present to his father for the death of Joseph. That reminds me of the nations.
I mean, you could still take it that way, that he's establishing the covenant, because in several places in the Old Testament it says that this war would bring even the people that fought the war to take
Right,
part of the
right.
covenant.
But let me finish with many, because I think it brings home what Daniel 9:27 is saying. You have the coat of many colors. You have in Isaiah, I will sprinkle many nations. You have Jesus saying, "This is the blood of the new covenant shed for many." Now go all the way back to Abraham, when God says to Abraham, "You'll be the father of many nations." God uses the word many times to depict the nations. So here you have, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. If this is a prophecy about the coming of Christ, and there's a covenant being confirmed with many, then how could it be anybody else in Christ? You see what I'm saying?
I'm not saying that it doesn't have to be Christ, but I'm saying it's if you go back to verse 26, it says the prince that is coming.
Mhm.
I would say that is referring to Titus coming because Christ already came. I mean, it's like you said, you could argue either way that it is Christ, but it was Titus that actually did the physical fulfillment.
You know what? I was shocked to find out, being a dispensationalist for so many years, and then quickly being deep brainwashed. I was really shocked to find out that some of the old commentators, oh wait, I know I probably told you guys this story, but I'm going to try to make it really fast. The one thing that got me out of dispensationalism is this verse right here, Daniel 9:27. I was a hardcore dispensationalist. I was reading Daniel for the millionth time, and I was praying and asking God to show me what it means very clearly. And I'm reading Daniel 9:27, and as a dispensationalist, he is the Antichrist who makes a covenant with Israel and then breaks it in the middle. That's what dispensationalists believe. So I read, and he shall confirm a covenant, and I heard this thing that is almost an audible voice say, "That's me." And I said I actually said, "No, God, he is Antichrist, isn't it?" And I heard again, "No, that's me." And I'm like, wait a minute. He is Jesus, the Christ, not the Antichrist? So the first thing I did is I went to Google and I typed in, who is the he? And the search bar finished for me in Daniel 9:27. So I clicked on it and I started reading articles, and I started finding out that the commentators of old all put he, like Matthew Henry, for example. He is Jesus. So I just wanted to throw that little thing in because this verse is super important to me. This is the verse that de-brainwashed me. Because that little he, and it used to be in the original King James, it used to be capitalized, and it was changed.
Yeah, and the Brenton, the word he's not even in there.
Well, I don't know. There's a lot of variations, that's for sure.
Wait, let me look at that actually. Interesting. Let me look at the Old Testament in the Hebrew here. Hold on. That would be actually really interesting. Is that's just like a, because I don't actually see that. Hold on, let me look.
It's basically put there for reading.
Yeah, so that means the interpretation doesn't necessarily. I mean, it fits. Let me see what it says in the Hebrew.
Well,
first.
whether the word he is there, there's a confirmation of a covenant.
But I guess it gives weight to what Rob is saying. Yeah, so let me look.
I mean, either way, really, it's not a big difference. It still can work out either way. The only thing is, I think the math definitely doesn't work out. And then what Messiah said about it being 46 years can't work out, and everything has to line up perfectly.
So wait, you're saying about the 46 years, because if Jesus is in his ministry, which I say is the first half of the 70th week, and he says it took 46 years to build a temple.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is, well, 46 years before, that would put you in the
before he said that would put you at 20 or 19 BC.
So wait a minute, this 46 years would be, well, not necessarily, because the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem doesn't start with the rebuilding of the temple. It starts with the streets.
There's two different things going on here. See, one is the decree. That's when this was first, the 70 weeks started. And then the street shall be built again, the wall even in times of affliction. That's talking about during Messiah, like the right before Messiah came.
Right.
So one's the decree, 70 weeks, and then the street being built again, that was 62 weeks later.
Right. So could Jesus have been referring to Herod's rebuilding of a temple that was already there?
That's my point.
Which is what he did.
That's what I'm saying. The math doesn't work out if we say that, if we put this in the midst of the week being otherwise, because then
but Herod building the temple, or starting to, basically he didn't build it, he renovated it.
Right.
I don't think
that's why it says built again.
I don't think that timing pertains to anything when Herod started renovating the temple. I don't think that has anything to do with the timing of the 70th week. It's just somewhere within everything that's going on.
Oh no, I'm saying that it has to happen after 62 weeks, and the 62 weeks they don't work out then.
Yeah, because you're saying the 62 weeks. So if I'm looking at, let me see here. So, and thou shalt know and understand that the going forth of the command of the answer and the building of Jerusalem until Christ the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and then shall return to the streets. So you're saying that the 62 weeks is the same thing that Jesus said when he said, "Oh, it took us, it took your father's 40, what was it, 42 years or 46 years? Or
46 years, yeah.
Yeah, 46 years to rebuild this temple." And then, and then that's when they're like, "You're going to knock it down in 3 days or build it back up in 3 days?"
Yeah, so if you have the middle of the week being in 70 AD, then the 46 years can still match up the 62 weeks. But if you say that the midst of the week is with the first part, then it has a conflict with that. But other than that, I could see why you think that. I mean, other than that, that's my only main issue.
Yeah, I mean, I read Daniel 9. Obviously, there's the destruction going on there, and it's the answer to Daniel's prayer. It's the answer to his question, what's going to happen. At the same time, you have two things going on. You have the coming of the Messiah. You also have the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the bittersweetness.
Here's a literal translation, and it reads like that easy reading one I read earlier. After 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of a coming ruler shall destroy the city and sanctuary, and its end shall be with a flood, and the ruins are determined, and the war shall be until the end. And he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, and in the middle of the week he shall cause the sacrifice offering to cease. And on the corner of the altar will be abominations that desolate, even until the end, that which was the decreed poured out on the desolator. So even a literal translation says it's a people of a coming ruler, not the Messiah. And he's the one that causes the sacrificing offering to cease. Yes, Messiah and God are the one behind the people of becoming ruler. They're the ultimate cause, but the ones that actually do the handiwork are the Romans. Let me try downloading another literal version here, see what it has.
I mean, I guess we're all assuming, but the 70th week here is the end, as in 70 AD, the end? Like, does it say that? Or does it say, like, there'll be the 70 weeks until all such and such, and then the end, after that?
Well, if 70 weeks are determined, then that means the end of the 70th week is the end of the determined time. And it's obvious, we know Israel was destroyed in 70 AD.
Right.
And we know the siege lasted 3.5 years.
Well, I think it's interesting. Isaiah 6 talks about how it'll be made desolate, but then a tenth of the people will return. Because everyone always says, like, oh, the earth's going to be burned up. It's going to be totally desolate. Then if you look at several places in the Old Testament, there are always people returning.
Yeah, but Paul even changes the word return to be saved. So Paul interprets those passages. Of course, if you read the Old Testament passages at face value, it's going to tell you that Israel's going to return to their land, but we know that's not what happens. So Paul comes around and he says, no. I'm going to tell you the mystery that God showed me. All Israel will be saved by believing in Christ, not by going to a land. So Paul kind of changes, on purpose. So, I can't go back to those Old Testament passages that talk about, northern tribes returning and Israel going back to the land. And,
well, I think that was the first part. That was his first coming. And they were coming to hear him talk and teach and magnify the law. So I think they did return to hear God.
Yeah, but I'm talking about after the diaspora from 70 AD. They're not returning to the land.
I'm trying to remember any verses that jump out.
See, I feel that all those Old Testament verses about Israel being brought back to the land, they're all couched in mystery, which is precisely why Paul comes along and says, hey, I got a mystery that was revealed to me that wasn't made known in ages past. What's the mystery? Jew and Gentile together in one body. So, of course, when you read the Old Testament passages, you're going to read them talking about Israel going back to the land. Paul even takes one of those Isaiah verses and changes it and totally changes it from a remnant shall return. He changes it to a remnant shall be saved. I used to think Paul changes those verses because he's quoting from the Septuagint, but while that might be true here and there, I believe he's changing the verses because he's telling you about the mystery that wasn't known before. And it's the dispensationalist that reads all of those Old Testament prophecies and says, oh, see, Israel, they haven't gotten back to their land. This still has to happen. They're not understanding that wasn't the plan. The plan was for God to make a new covenant built on better promises, a better covenant on better promises. Why does the Young's literal translation still say, and he hath strengthened a covenant with many?
Yeah, I was just looking at that. I still think that's not too bad because I think the covenant was being strengthened by the war and such.
See, I believe that the Abrahamic covenant is the initial place where God makes that covenant with Abraham. He tells him he's going to be the father of many nations. And what he's got in mind is, I'm going to send my son, and he's going to shed his blood for many. And that's how they will be adopted as children. So God, tells Abraham to cut up the animals, sever them, to separate them. Abraham falls asleep. God passes through in the smoking fire pot and creates the covenant, makes the covenant. And then 2,000 years later, Jesus is the smoking fire pot. He's between the two men, and the same darkness, it says in Genesis, a horror of darkness covered over as God, went through. The same darkness fell upon the crucifixion. And Jesus is between the two men, only now it's God in a man's body, not a smoking fire pot. And he's confirming the covenant with many that God made with Abraham from the beginning. It's not inaugurated yet. It's simply being confirmed. Like, this is going to take place. This is the confirmation, the cross. And I'm bringing Jew and Gentile together. The two men even represent Jew and Gentile. One is mocking him and not believing and saying, save yourself and us if you're the Messiah. And the other one says, hey, if you, how can you, don't you even fear death when you're dying? This man has done nothing wrong. He declares Jesus' sinlessness by saying this man has done nothing wrong. And then he declares men's sinfulness when he says, we deserve what we're getting. And then he tells Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, just like a Gentile would do. Hey, can I be included into your new covenant? So Jesus on the cross is almost a replay of Abraham in the initial covenant, and Jesus is confirming the covenant with many. It's the same terminology. Father of many nations, confirming the covenant with many. And Jesus just said a few nights before that, this is the blood of the new covenant shed for many. So that's the whole reason why, I put this together. Romans 15:8 says Jesus has become a minister of the circumcision to confirm the promises made to the fathers. What's the promise made to the fathers?
What do you do with like the part of 27 that seems to go with the midst of the week, though, and by the wing of the abominations he is making desolate?
Well, it's another interjection, because now it's telling you, and for the overspreading of abominations, in other words, for all these things that Israel did, and we know why Israel was judged, it's because of their abominations. God tells them, and I've seen your abominations. So for all you've done and all your abominations, I'm going to make you desolate. I think that's all it's saying. It is convoluted language for sure, but we know what happened. So we don't have to guess.
But the sacrifice and offering didn't end in 30 AD.
If you look at the new covenant being established on the cross, in God's mind, there were no more sacrifices. There was only one sacrifice from that point on. So in that manner, Christ abolished the sacrifices. He ended them right there on the cross, once for all. That's how I look at it. Did they sacrifice animals for the next, 40 years? Yeah. Didn't mean anything. So it seems like there's it's talking about the desolation. It's giving you the time frames. It's, in my mind, it's telling you that Jesus will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So basically, the whole Daniel 70th week is a confirmation of the covenant. But in the midst, he stops the sacrifices by being the sacrifice.
Yeah, I definitely can see where you're coming from. I mean, definitely there's quite a few commentators that look at it that way as well, and others that don't.
Yeah, I mean, I never read commentators in my whole life. I really can't stand it. You can read five of them, and they all say something similar yet different. And so I can't. I basically believe that just through studying and praying. But if other commenters uh, agree with it, then that's pretty cool, I guess. But I don't know. I can't read it any other way, Rob. I got to tell you, I can't see the he being Titus.
Well, I don't think you have to take it that way. It can still be Christ no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, you have to be able to at least see that the possibility that it could be when the temple was destroyed as well, because definitely there was no more sacrifice after that point.
Isn't the NASB supposed to be somewhat of a literal but readable translation? That one says he will make a firm covenant. That's not right. If it is Jesus, he's not making a covenant. He's definitely confirming an already existing covenant. If the covenant is the Abrahamic covenant, then he's simply confirming it. See, I think that the cross was the confirmation of the Abrahamic covenant. But I think the day of Pentecost, which is Shavuot, 50 days
Well, let me
later.
ask you this. Okay. You have the understanding that he's confirming the covenant during his first ministry for half of the week, right?
Well, he's saying he's confirming covenant with many for 1 week.
Right. So the first half is his first coming, right? So how did he confirm the covenant, the second part?
Well, I believe that on 50 days after the resurrection, so you count the counting of the Omer was 49 days, and then the 50th day is Pentecost or Shavuot, and that's when the Spirit was given. So when the Spirit was given, it was basically around the same time of the month when the law was given at Mount Sinai after they had left Egypt. It's almost a replay of the first Exodus. So you have the giving of the Spirit now, but it's in parallel with the giving of the first covenant, which is now obsolete. The giving of the Spirit is the new covenant. Now you go from flesh to spirit. That's why Paul always uses the words flesh and spirit in contrast. So on the day of Pentecost or Shavuot, God pours out his Spirit. Shav and ot is a compound word. Shav means 7, where you get Sabbath. Ot means oath or promise or sign. Oath is actually sign. So Shavuot is the sign of sevens. What's it a sign of? Pentecost was a sign of the new covenant, and Christ was cut off, but not for himself, but he came in the flesh, right? So if Christ came in the flesh and was cut off, Christ is a picture of the cutting off of the flesh. What's the sign of the Abrahamic covenant? Circumcision. What's circumcision? The cutting off of the flesh. So the covenant with the Abrahamic covenant is confirmed on the cross, but it's inaugurated on Shavuot with the giving of the Spirit, because now you have the cutting off of the flesh and the giving of the Spirit. That's why Paul keeps saying, like, or Jesus, like, said to the woman at the well, the Father seeks those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. And then he says to Nicodemus, flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. So Christ is already like getting you ready in John, 3 and John 4 for the change from flesh to spirit, and that's what happens on the day of Shavuot or Pentecost. So I see that the 50 days as kind of like a jubilee after the first fruits. I think you counted 49 days from the first fruit offering to Shavuot. And then the day after is Shavuot, the 50th day. And it's the sign, Shavuot is the sign of sevens. So
I'll tell you an old belief of mine that you might be interested in, which still could possibly be true. So if we look at it like interjections, like you're saying, it could be the 70 weeks were all in order. There's no gap, and this was the way it would work. So he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In the midst of the week, he's cut off and crucified. And then the rest of that week, he teaches Paul for 3.5 years in Arabia.
See, go through that one more time.
Yeah. So the 70 weeks are all in order. There's no gap. He's cut off in the midst of the week, 3.5 years of the ministry. And then the rest of the week, the 3.5 years, he teaches Paul, because it says he was 3 years he was taught by Christ, Paul says. So the rest of the week he taught Paul
for 3.5 years. But you have a lot of space from the end of that period up until 66 to 70 AD. Then what do you do with that?
You would just look at it as an interjection, like you said. So the 70 weeks are all in order, but then it's just describing an events after the 70 weeks, basically.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. Like, is it saying that 70 AD is part of this, or just something that happens afterwards? Like, the 70 weeks are already finished.
Right. So it's not necessarily, it wouldn't have to be part of the 70 weeks, but just describing something that happens after the second week's, giving you the end, the whole end picture.
See, I look at the answer to the prayer when Gabriel answers Daniel. I think he's giving him Israel's history. Like, this is it. He's describing right to the end of Israel's history, which is, Amos says, the end of my people has come upon them. That's why, like, dispensationalists, one thing that they don't realize is they want to place the crucifixion in this big 2,000-year gap, even though, it happened much closer to the first half of the 70th week. But they place the crucifixion in the gap. And one thing they don't realize is if the crucifixion is in the gap, then it doesn't pertain to Israel's history. You would think. But it does, because he's crucified in the midst of the week. If you look at Daniel's 70th week as the last 7 years of Israel's history, then of course the crucifixion is happening during their history, but their history seems to end in 70 AD with their destruction. So I don't know, to me that it just seems to fit so nicely. I can't even imagine it happening any other way. The only thing
the way you would read that is like, so he's cut off in the midst of the week, then he teaches Paul, and then it says even to the desolate to the end, basically. So he's given the description of 70 weeks, and then he says, and then I'll make it desolate even to the end. Just something to think about.
Yeah. Not easy. Daniel 9 is like, that's the whole reason I was praying. I must have read that thing 1,000,000 times.
Yeah, 1,000,001 tonight. Yeah, I'm gonna head out. My family just showed up from being out of town, so.
Oh, nice. Yeah, it's kind of late. So, anyway, brothers, great discussion.
Yeah, night, brothers. Sleep good.